Okay, so for part 3 of our adventure into coding this module, we're going to add the radio buttons, introduce you to list. We'll call them node list or arrays, and then we'll talk about looping. So in this case, here's what we're trying to do. In our form, we have now acquired through our code the values for these items, right? So for household members, house size, and if they live in an apartment. So now we're going to move on to this section. So this section, and if we look at the requirements, right? So on the WikiHow for evaluating your food sources, you have based on your diet type, you have points added, and then based on how you source that food or how it's packaged, right? So, and this, I like this because this really is to me reflective of this idea of food sources, because it's not only what you eat but how you source it. So in this case, we have two inputs. I guess that's my point. We have these radio buttons. So we've seen, right, the standard input. We've seen checkboxes. And so now we're going to see radio buttons. And in this case, the radio buttons, the way we've written the HTML, only one of these can be selected. And if you look at the actual HTML for this, which again, we harpen back to the beginning of the week when we actually spent a little time in attendance talking about this, you can see that all of these are grouped together in a div, right? And they also, in this case, if we go a little deeper, here's the label, that just gives it the label, but then here's the input. So we have an ID, we have a name, and we have a value. So the value would indicate which this user selected, okay, of all these. But notice how they all share the same name. And that's a clue to what we're going to need, because basically what we want to do is write code that determines which of these the user selected, because we know they could select a variety, right? They can select a combination of these things. And so we therefore can't necessarily do what we did on the other ones, because there was really only the value and a checkbox. So in this case, we got to do a little more work to get this done. And this is good because this is very, very normal, commonplace stuff with JavaScript that handles it very well. Okay, one thing I'm going to start with, and I probably should have done this before because it kept bugging me, is up here. I'm going to get rid of the event for now. Just because I was looking at the output and I was like, you know what, there's really more output here than we need. So right now we know that in our code, in our form handler, we're returning that object literal, and then in the app.js, we are then outputting that at the console.log, and we learned all about the dot notation and how to review that. Okay. I think actually it's not here, so I think I'm going to go ahead and include it in the app.js. I guess in all my coding I did this where I did console log and I just outputted the form data just to see the object as it exists. Yeah, there it is. Okay, so again, this is just reviewing. So let's now think about this idea of how we're going to acquire this and based on the way the data is set up. So over in our form handler, and in this case I'm not starting with declaring something in my app.js because I'm only going to need this reference, which is like what we did here in our module, which is a nice way to not again pollute the global space. Okay, so I'm going to add this first line in here. Okay, give it a space. So what we're going to do here is in the food choices, remember we have a diet and we have packaging. So we need to query all. So this is a key. So where we have queried only the specific ID, now we're going to query all based on the name. And this is going to return something different because this returned a specific reference, and this is going to provide us a list of these references, and you'll see this. So let's go ahead and code it and then we'll look at it. So in this case, we'll say diet type, and I'm going to call this radios. Okay, now again, I'm making up this name, but I want something that describes what I'm looking at. Okay, so I'm going to say again, carbon footprint. I'm referencing this one. So these are in this case not as expensive. I've talked a little about that, but we always want our code to be as efficient as we can make it. Now here's where we go different, is that instead of selector, we're going to say select all. Now in this case, because we're selecting all that meets our particular criteria. And if you've taken database, like if you happen to be taking my SQL course, this actually will make a little more sense, but we'll describe it as we go. We say query input, and in this case we're going to do brackets. And we're going to say a specific type of input where the name is equal to, in this case, diet type, which is what I showed you before. Okay, oh, actually, that is supposed to be a quote there, and that ends that. Okay, all right, so making now this syntax, right? So the way you would read that is like, okay, query the carbon footprint, look for any input with the name of diet type. So harkening back to what we saw before, right, on the elements, that these have all shared diet type. So we're basically saying, look at this and give me the references for all of this for the diet type. So let's actually now see this in action by going to sources, coming up to our form handler, going up to here. And then now remember, because this is in the scope that is loaded and I wouldn't call this global, because this is actually scope that is global only to the form handler. So it's modular scope. So when I want to see it, I just have to reload the page, because that's what gets loaded or executed and set up in the reload. So now that I'm here, I can just go ahead and execute this line and roll back through and see something called a node list. So check this out. So what it's returning, and you can actually see this in the rendered page. And again, follow along here, because me showing you one thing, it's another thing for you to do it yourself to get a sense of what this is. So because we're querying all, saying show me any, I'm getting back a list. Now this is a particular kind of list called a node list, but it's really just a type of array. Now there are differences, but this gives us a chance to at least talk about arrays. So what I want to do is now down on the console, now that we have this variable, let's do diet type, and now I'll place it here just to give you that idea from the console. But I want to show you when you're dealing with, in this case, node list or arrays, this is true, they have an index. So if I want to see a particular one of these, I would have to reference it by its index. And indexes are, I want to say always, they start with 0. So if I wanted to only see a particular one, then what I would do, I'm going to go up arrow, I'm going to go do brackets here, I'll do 0. So show me the first one, right? So that gives me access just to the first eat on diet type. Okay, so then I can see this is the resulting radio button, the input button, which is a type radio right there. Okay, but what if I wanted to pull out just its value? Then I would do dot value. Okay, then that would give me, if the user had selected this one, right, then it would give me, if I did this expression, it would return to me this value. So first, what we're going to do in code, though, is we want to go through every one and see which one is checked. Because remember, only one can be checked at a time in the way that we've created these radio buttons. But this is a good thing to start understanding. And we're just going to see it in action, not in its ultimate form, but just as a way to start understanding the code. So having this now, we could come down to our return, and we could hard code just to get a sense of what this would look like, right? And it could equal to diet radio buttons. And let's just say, now this is not what the user is selecting, but it gives us a way to see that value. It represents that specific index in the node list, which is an array. So let's now say 1. Okay, so if we did that with what I've shown you, which one would it point to? Would be diet average. Okay, but let's actually, oh, it's not semicolon, sorry, we're inside of an object literal. Okay, so if we do return that, then let's come over here. Okay, copy just the last one. So the key of diet type, value of, in this case, right, diet type. Okay, so now we can at least see that get returned. Let's go ahead and see that in action, because my hope is that it just helps you see what's happening here. Okay, so we'll return it. So, oh, yeah, so this is great. This is so great. How did I do that? All right, I just put 1. So in this case, it returned the reference. Now, you might go, Rio, this doesn't look like the references we've been seeing. And that's true. So when you see either object, object, or object HTML input, it's basically saying the way you've given it to me, I can't actually read that. And the reason is I forgot to do value. Okay, so let's see it again. So now I can see that value of average. Okay, so before it wouldn't output because I didn't have the average on there. Now, this is clearly not the way we want to do it, but it at least helps you see, right, how we reach into our reference and grab one specific item. But what we really want to do is we really want to actually look at each one, and the most common way to do that, if I come over here, is a loop. So looping is, in this case, we're going to use a for of loop, and I'll have you in your prompting actually do some look at other loops, because there are several in JavaScript. But I think the for loop, and for those of you who've had prior programming, you might think of the old for loop. This is a newer for loop, and it is really nice because it'll iterate, which means it'll loop over. So anytime you see iteration, iterable, it is the idea of looping. Okay, so you go 1, you look at the first one, you look at the second one. And so in this case, we're going to loop over what I've said is the node list is like an array. Now, this is true that it provides more concise and readable ways to loop through values versus something like the for each, which is also, I really love the for each. But when we're looking at the syntax, this is what it looks like. For, a variable we set up, and this of says, hey, what is the thing that is iterable? Meaning, what is the data structure, in this case, that I'm going to loop over to execute the code, be executed for each value. So let's actually see this in action now that you at least have an introduction for it. And in this case, let's actually write it inside here. We're going to refactor it over time. But let's say for, and this is what I like to do, is I always like to stamp out the signature, like all the syntax I need is here, so now I fill in the pieces. So const, remember what it said, variable, right? So the variable, in this case, I'm going to give it is called radio. Now, I've determined what that is. I could call it anything I want because it is a variable name. And in this case, of. Okay, so constant radio of. And what are we looking at? We're going to actually look at this node list. So we could say, because remember that reference contains that node list. Right, so there we go. So now we can say console.log. And now we're going to do some output so that we can kind of peer into what this radio is. Okay, let's go ahead and set up a template string. Let's go ahead and inject the variable using the template string because it's just better practice and it gives us more flexibility. But this will be step 1. Okay, so let's see this in action now. Let's come down here. There's where we're at. We'll set the breakpoint here. So this will be fired when we hit calculate footprint. And you can already see here, which is awesome. You can, because we're inside, it has executed the first one. And what it means here when I say execute is like, here's the entire list of references. And now the first one in this case, and it's a little hard to see here, but when I execute the console.log, again, it's kind of like what we saw before. So we've already seen how to make this a little more clear by just putting value. Okay, so let's do that. Let's let this run. Cool. And then we'll do it again. Okay, so now when I execute the console.log, then I get that that specific name, right? Or sorry, that value of that radio button, which is what I need ultimately to store in here. So kind of step one, or at least conceptually, I have that, right? So what's the other thing I'm going to want to know? So in this case, right, is has the attribute of, and in this case, I'm just going to take this because I don't want to type it again. I'm getting a little bit lazy. So I'm going to copy this. So now I'm going to peer in, and I didn't show you this in the console, but you're going to see it now, is I now have another one. Okay, so I now am going to look for the idea of checked. Is it checked? And that is a Boolean value. Okay, now don't let this confuse you when you're looking at the actual, here we go, that when you look at this, the first one is checked, that's its default value. Okay, so it's actually clicking it, so when the browser loads, it's saying, hey, that's the default value, and we'll change the default value so you can really see this happen in a moment, and we'll let this run. Okay, so now what we've done, oh, I don't have the latest code. Let's get the latest code, right? So now let's let this run. And so now let's step in. Okay, so heavy meat has an attribute of true. Okay, so actually the checked is true. So if we want to see, is it dynamically looking at each one? Oh, let's let it run its thing. Oh yeah, so it's got to go through each one. Yeah, I forgot where we're at. We're looping, so it's showing you each one, right? So in this case, meat has an attribute, heavy meat is true, average is false, and which we see because they're not clicked, right? And so you can see why this produced that. And again, if the user clicks something different, I run it again, I hit, run. And again, if I come down here and I just let it run to see the output, then I can see, oh, it's like I didn't let it run. Yeah, let me just let the whole thing run and get through it. So now we see that oh, I guess I'm not letting it run. Okay, so now we can see what I was talking about. So your average is now true. Okay, so it's when this is true that we want to do something. Okay? And we've learned how to write code. This is if some condition exists, then do this. So this is where we could come over to here, and now we could say if radio.checked. Now, this would be the way you might think of, and it's not wrong to do it this way if it's true. Okay, so again, this is our logic, right? So if, let's say here, I put this inside of here, right? So I said, okay, when it's true, run this. I don't have an else because I don't need it. All I'm checking for is once this is found its condition to equal true, then run this. So instead of what I saw before, which is outputting, now you're only going to see it until when it's actually true. So let's actually select a different one just so you can see this. Okay, so first time, not true. Second time, right? Now it's true. I should have rolled over to see that. But again, that's where running it on your side should make this clearer. Okay, so vegetarian has the attribute of true. Awesome, right? And so now it's going to return. But see, again, we've hard-coded this. So we've at least now written code that does what we want, which is look at the attribute for each of the, in this case, the diet choices, to see which one is true. And when it is true, which by the way, the other way you can write this is just like this, because that resolves to a true. Is, remember, so when I was looking at it on the console, when I was looking at it on the console, it resolves to a Boolean. Okay, so now I can write this very simply with a little less code, but it is good to understand because you're going to see code like this and you'll wonder, what is it checking for? Well, remember, what it does is it evaluates that expression and it resolves to, in this case, true or false. But the more elaborate these if statements are, you'll have to understand what each piece is doing when we add and or later. But let's say, for now, okay, let's say that our condition is met. Now what do we want to do? Well, now we actually want to set its value down here. Okay, so there's a couple of ways we could do this. We could do it right here. We could say const, right? And we could say selected, let's say select diet type. Okay, and in this case we could set it to null. Because we're using const, if we use let, we wouldn't need to do this. And because we're only setting it once. Now, this is one of those edge cases where you have to think about, would I use const? Because it's only going to get to this line one time based on the loop. So I would use const, but you might think let, and you're not necessarily wrong, but it is good just to understand. So now what are we going to do with this variable here, right? Well, the challenge with this is, and this I'm going to come back here, is if we try to do this, which kind of might make sense, right? Oh yeah, so sorry, if it's true, I got to finish this line. I didn't finish the code. I wrote this, but if I'm going to set up the variable, and then I could say select type. Now I could do it all in one line. I'm just kind of trying to help you reason about what we're doing is going to be equal to radio, right? Dot value. Cool. So now we're setting that variable to radio dot value. Okay, so now we've set a value, a variable based on our condition. So now how do we get it here, right? Because that's how we want to do that. And here's where you might think we could just do this. And this is why I've written it this way, actually. Okay, so I'm going to do select. Can I just reference that variable here? And just think to yourself, can we do this? Okay, let's see if we can do this. Okay, so let's, boom. So we're here. Okay, we've set it, and it was hard to see, but actually in this line in 49, right? Right. This was part of why I was showing you, right? This is part of why I'm showing you, because it would make sense maybe because you're like, well, wait a minute, I'm going to, and we haven't even talked about null, so maybe this wasn't the best example, right? So let's say now, because this is kind of, I'm trying to show you probably too many things at one time. This is where actually let would make sense, okay? Okay, so let would make sense to use here. Okay, so let's run it again. Okay, so let's run. Good. So now we didn't get the error, right? So we're looping, and it's only the first one. So now it's going to go, okay. All right, so now we have defined inside of this, inside of here. Okay, so we have a scope here, we have a scope here, and we've defined a variable here. The question would be, can we access that scope from here? And the answer is no, because of where we've written it, right? So in this case, right here, we'd put this outside of the loop so that whenever we're done, we have access to it. Okay, so we're layering on a couple of pieces here, because if I just showed you the ultimate output, it may not make sense depending on how much experience you've had. So let's come back up here, right? So now let's go right here. Let's take this off. Let's hit submit. Good. So now we know we have, and I should have selected these so you could see the difference, but hopefully you got the idea here. So we've set up. So if I don't have a value, and actually for a let, I could have left this off, but I just decided to show you I've set up a variable. I've given it a null, which is basically nothing in a sense. And now I'm setting that variable to this. Okay. Now it's actually going to go through, because I've had it loop over each one. So now, even though I'm out of the loop and I'm out of the, because remember, there's two scopes here, I do have access. And how do I know that? Because I've rolled over this because I'm outside of it. And now if I hit step, I actually can set that here, which is great, right? So let's go ahead here, right? Let's go ahead and look at our object. So diet type heavy meat. And then we could come over here, click another one, see if it is actually dynamically, and we'll let it run, working. And now diet type of vegetarian. So this is doing conceptually what we want. Actually, beyond conceptual, it's actually doing what we want. We're just going to make it more efficient. Okay? So in this case, let's actually add some comments here. Okay? Did we add this one yet? So just to review what we did here, back on the right here, okay? So, and actually, this is the food choice reference, okay? And it returns a node list, which is array-like, okay? So we know that that's true, right? And the arrays have 0 indexed, okay? And then object, oh yeah, we've already done this. Actually, we'll put this in. I'll probably put this, actually no, it's okay to do this now, because we know that this, and this is actually something we've done before, but I'm just going to include it because it's what's happening is we're returning an object that contains all the collected values, okay? And then here, earlier, and I probably should have done this earlier, I think I'm not going to put this one so you don't have to, but it reminds me to show you, right, that how we hard-coded that index before, that's how we might might reference the individual buttons, but then we learned how to loop over. So in this case, we're learning how to loop over the node list, okay? And then we learned about the for each, which is great, right? So we looped over, we used a for each. Remember, there are other ones to use. And then for each item, and then for each, as it loops over, this is what's happening is code is executed for each value. And then we're using a condition to check. So at this point, we're going to stop this here, and I'm going to pick it up to where we actually now kind of we actually make this code much more efficient. Okay, so let's look at your prompts, right? Oh, and I did this actually already as well. I added that diet type into there. So explain the difference between query selector all. How is a node list and array the same, and how are they different? Because they are. Explain indexes on arrays, and how are checkbox and radio buttons different in JS. Okay, so do your version control, and then we'll hit the last one, and then we'll be done with this. All right, talk to you later.